Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Tim here. I think Hour of Devastation has been out for long enough that we can start talking about the format with some confidence as far as how we should be drafting the set and what we should be on the lookout for. As always, we'll be looking at each individual color, thinking about what the color wants to be doing within the format, and making a decision about what the top picks in that color should be. A slight change for those of you who watch any of my previous videos like this. I'll be selecting only one honorable mention and one winner for each color rather than two, although I'll still have a separate pick for commons and uncommons. I've not discussed colorless cards here or multicolor or land cards, nor any aftermath cards, so don't expect to see any here. And finally, keep in mind that this is solely based on my opinions and experiences from my own personal testing. If you disagree with one of my picks, super cool. Tell me why in the comments and let's talk about it. That being said, let's jump in. White was a very solid color in triple Amonkhet draft, and between bomb commons and uncommons like Gustwalker and Trial of Solidarity, it lended itself to a hyper-aggressive playstyle. With the addition of Hour of Devastation, the format has slowed down significantly, although white decks still tend to lean towards aggro, with a special emphasis on exert creatures. Note that aggro white decks often have a heavy zombie sub-theme as well. White also tends to close out games with some of its larger flying creatures, and you can often build a go-wide strategy using mass pump spells as your primary win condition. My honorable mention for best white common showcases exactly how much I value aggressive strategies when I'm drafting white. Dauntless Aven is already fine as a 2-power flyer for 3 mana, which you would play a high percentage of the time even without an extra ability. The Aven's real power is in its combo potential with exert creatures, letting you exert other creatures without any real drawback, lending to some really busted plays. And while the Aven is vulnerable to 1 toughness shenanigans like Blur of Blades or Fervent Paincaster, it is a nice foil to tap-in effects like Fanbearer or Unquenchable Thirst. For uncommons, I have to go with Steward of Solidarity, which actually displays our Aven friends' exert synergies nicely. Steward is a poster child for premium 2-drops, having relevance as a blocker or attacker early in the game, and being able to maintain value in the late game by creating a token every other turn. Maybe a 1/1 every other turn doesn't sound crazy, but when you consider that most 2-drops just fall off and stop doing anything relevant after the first few turns, you can definitely see how Steward of Solidarity scales into the late game. Did I mention that white's an aggro-focused color? Catcher's Avenger takes the cake when it comes to aggressive white creatures. If your opponent can't get a creature up on the first couple of turns, they're going to take a beating. And when they do have a blocker, they're very likely getting hit anyway. While not quite as good, the Avenger is similar to Gustwalker in its ability to push right past blockers, and the Avenger's ability to prevent combat damage means you're not likely to get punished for attacking. I don't believe aggro is as dominant as it was during Triple Amonkhet, but a Catcher's Avenger certainly pulls its weight when your plan is turning sideways and attacking. White has tons of great uncommons, but I'm calling it Desert's Hold is white's best non-rare for the set. Ignore the 3 life for just a moment. This is literally just a rest, which locks down a creature pretty much permanently. Consider this a huge upgrade to compulsory rest, which I would argue is already a high-pick pseudo-removal spell. Considering that white has to rely on finicky tricks like Sandblast or Farm to clear off most creatures, Desert's Hold comes as a nice, clean answer that fits into aggro and control shells alike. Oh, and sometimes you gain life, which feels amazing. Blue had a pretty bad rap in Amonkhet, and that's reasonable. If you didn't open a bomb rare, there wasn't much of an incentive to move into the color. Blue has a bit more depth this time around and can take a number of avenues when drafting. There's a host of cards that fit into an aggressive blue deck, usually backed up with tempo cards and prowess creatures. You can also play the attrition game, specifically in blue light, by going deep on Embalm or Eternalized creatures. And as is the case with most formats, you can often draft flyers in a control shell and go over the top of your opponents. I honestly think most people will disagree with my picks for blue commons here, but nonetheless, I'm picking Unsummon as my honorable mention for best blue common. I'm picking this for the same reasons I picked Essence Scatter as my best blue common in Triple Amonkhet. Blue decks tend to be slower, and it's crucial that you have early game interaction so as to not die to straight up aggro decks. Unsummon gives you defensive capability while also doubling as a great tempo card for blue beatdown decks. Spoiler alert, I picked this over Unquenchable Thirst, which I also find pretty good, just that if I'm playing blue, I usually want to be reactive, and I like the instant potential of Unsummon over the sorcery speed Unquenchable Thirst. My honorable mention for common blue cards follows my reasoning for picking Unsummon. Supreme Will lets you play control shells while being reactive towards your opponents. The flexibility on this card is just great. It's primarily an early to mid-game counterspell that doubles as a filter card when the first mode isn't as desirable. These two options play together fantastically, and I'm excited to pick these up for my blue-based control decks. I'm not sure how many people would be on board with this pick, but I honestly think Aerial Guide deserves its spot as best blue common. Windrake seems decent in this format, and this is so much more than that. Jumping another creature on attacks lets you smash for a ton of flying damage turn after turn, and turns your other aggressive creatures into evasive threats. A lot of times when you have Aerial Drake plus another powerful creature, your opponent has to actually prioritize using removal on the Drake because it just grants flying to the next big creature you have. That's not a bad spot to be in, and you'll play this guy in every blue deck you draft. Keeping in theme with powerful flyers, we have Ominous Sphinx as our top blue uncommon. Big flyer, below average mana cost, upside when cycling. Yeah, this card is a fantastic way to start off a draft should you not open a busted rare, and you don't even need to force the cycling sub-theme to make this card great. You're likely to just have random cyclers in your deck without specifically trying to make a cycling deck, and having mana up with an Ominous Sphinx makes it virtually impossible for your opponents to engage in combat. Threat of activation is a real thing, and this is often enough to just stop your opponent from attacking at all. Meanwhile, you get to bash for 4 in the air. Yeah, sounds like a keeper to me. Black decks in Amonkhet tended to be grindy, using cards like Wandering Death or Gravedigger to recur creatures for late game value. Black played very differently depending on what color it paired with, though, and most of those color combinations carry over here. You have black aggro decks, usually in the form of black white zombies. Black green usually takes advantage of -1/-1 counter themes, and black blue boasts various cycling strategies. With all those synergies, keep in mind that what black does best is bring good removal to the table. Lethal Sting is my honorable mention for black commons, but I want to put a little asterisk next to that statement. Lethal Sting reads like a mythic common, but I assure you it's not as good as it looks. Unconditional removal, especially for 3 mana, is obviously very good, but don't underestimate how much of a cost it actually is to put a -1 counter on one of your own creatures. Sometimes you have to put a counter on a 1 toughness creature, killing it off, and sometimes you don't have a creature at all, which is the nightmare scenario when you're trying to top deck your removal spells. It's a real cost, but overall I think I'm still happy playing Lethal Sting and still pick it highly. It's enough better than the other black commons that, drawback and all, I think it deserves this spot. With the exception of my number 1 pick, black uncommons are all kind of mediocre. I've picked Accursed Horde as my honorable mention, but I admit that it isn't a card I'm excited to first pick. It fits well in aggressive decks and goes way up in value for zombie decks, but it can be a bit clunky and mana intensive. That's not to say it's bad. Accursed Horde is certainly a strong card, but it's a fairly steep drop-off from my number 1 pick, which we'll see in a moment. If you're looking for solid black removal at common, I think you'd be much happier to have Torment of Venom than Lethal Sting. Instant speed is great here, -3/-3 is enough to kill most things, and even if it doesn't take that creature out, it leaves it vulnerable. And on top of this, you get added value out of your card by doming the opponent for 3 unless they lose a card. This is removal with a bonus, and is easily black's best common, no questions asked. It's worth noting that it's not very splashable, whereas something like Lethal Sting might be, but when you're playing black, you're snapping this up early in the pack. As for uncommons, Banewhip Punisher is not only the best black uncommon by a long shot, but probably one of the best non-rares in the entire set. It's functionally a 4-mana removal spell on its surface, and often much, much more than that. It's one of the many ways to punish 1 toughness creatures while also providing a small body to the board, and combos with other -1 counters like Grind to Dust or Splendid Agony. It's also just naturally good against creatures like Ame Eternal or Magma Wrath, which put -1 counters on themselves. Removal attached to creatures is fantastic, and spoiler alert, that's not the last time you'll hear me say that in this video. Pick it high and pick it often. Red was the big bully of Amonkhet, boasting unreasonably aggressive creatures and sometimes unbeatable curve outs. I've already mentioned that the pace of this format has slowed down significantly with the addition of Hour of Devastation, but Red is far from done. We're still mostly on the aggro train, with removal playing a key role in controlling aggro shells. Also note that Red has tons of ways to punish blocking with the new mechanic Afflict and an unusually high number of creatures that just lock down blockers altogether. Look, guys, I value removal highly. That's why I'm giving the honorable mention slot to Puncture and Blow. 5 damage for 4 mana is decent, certainly enough to take out nearly every threat in the format, but the real value here is in exiling the creature it hits. It shuts off Embalm and Internalize, and it's one of the few ways to effectively deal with the absurdly game-warping gods from Hour of Devastation. I don't recommend drafting to beat Mythics, but hey, it's a nice reassurance when it comes up. Think of this as a giant clunky magma spray. You don't want 3 or 4 in your deck, but the first one will always be good, and it fits in any red playstyle. Seriously, removal spells just win games limited. I have to open a pretty strong pack of Hour to pass up an Abrade. As with Supreme Will, flexibility is nice, but if we're being completely honest, we're not too concerned with blowing up an artifact. 3 damage at instant speed for just 2 mana is a steal. And every now and then, this functions as a shatter effect for annoying artifacts like Godpharaoh's Gift or Edifice of Authority. I believe this is at least a better pick than any common in the set, and I'd never be disappointed to start off a draft with it. You might be sensing a bit of a theme here. Red has solid common creatures, but when presented with the option to pick a good red creature or open fire, I'm taking the expensive Lightning Bolt. This is actually my current pick for second best common in the entire set, and it may just be number 1. It's good removal at a fair cost, and occasionally you'll close out a game by sending it straight to your opponent's face. We literally just got through looking at a Braid, and Open Fire, while not as efficient, is very close in power level. Don't expect to ever wheel this card, and if you see one late, you can be fairly certain that red is wide open to draft. Okay, well, the strongest red uncommon isn't technically a removal spell. Sand Strangler is your run-of-the-mill Hill Giant or 4-mana 3/3, but sometimes if you control a desert or you have one floating around your graveyard, when it hits the battlefield, you get to blast a creature for 3 damage. That's pretty strong. Add in 3 power to the board while taking out an opponent's creature. There are some times where you haven't hit your desert quite yet, but if you're not under a huge amount of pressure, you can play out your other cards and save your Strangler for when it will destroy a creature. Deserts aren't exceedingly difficult to pick up in the draft if you prioritize them, so starting off a draft with Sand Strangler gives you plenty of time to make sure you draft enough deserts to make it work, and trust me, when it works, it's huge. Last up is green, which had a bunch of different functions in Amonkhet Draft. This time around, we can expect green to be the home for ramp decks with powerful top-end creatures. Green also has a higher concentration of cards that care about deserts than most other colors, and honestly, most green decks will do what green does best, play above curve creatures and hope to beat the opponent deck. I'm fairly confident with my picks for green commons here, with Ronus' Stalwart taking the honorable mention slot. Another Gustwalker wannabe, Ronus' Stalwart is a bear with an evasive exert trigger, letting it attack as a 3/3 that can't be blocked by smaller creatures. The Stalwart is a fantastic way to punish your opponent for relying on walls and death touch creatures as their primary defense. Not to mention, Stalwart is already reasonable as a 2-mana 2/2. Not much else to say, it's a solid beater and a strong early to mid-pick draft pick. Uncommons are a little more dicey, and green has some sweet cards to pick from. As much as I wanted to put this card in the top spot, I pushed Sifter Worm down to honorable mention status. This card is incredible when you slam it on the battlefield, giving you card selection and life gain on top of a huge trampling body. It's exactly the type of top end you're trying to put in your ramp decks, and the fact that it gains life is a great way to make sure you survive after making it to the late game. This is green's great stabilizer, but unfortunately, I think there's a card that deserves the top spot over it. Sorry, Sifter Worm, maybe next time. All right, let's come out with it. I'm putting my foot down and I'm calling it. Ambuscade is the best common in the set. This is absolutely absurd at common. Instant speed, one-sided fight spells with power boosts are objectively good. Yes, I understand that just like Lethal Sting, there are times when you don't have the creature to back it up, but you're playing green, which tends to mean you're a creature-heavy deck. People always warn about how spells like this leave openings for the caster to get blown out, and that's fair, but if you play smart, you can avoid it. That same point goes back to why I value Unsummon so highly. It's just an efficient means of counteracting cards like this. You're getting an uncommon quality card when you draft this, which says quite a bit for this being a common. Final card on our list, something that I've already heard stories about. Whether you're on the overrated side of things or the, oh, I got destroyed by it side of the fence, I'm confident giving the top uncommon spot to Overcome. See, there are times when Overcome isn't great, but when you do cast it, it usually wins the game on the spot. Sifter Worm, as good as it is, does quite a bit, but isn't usually enough to end the game on its own. Overcome is. It's not too difficult to put together a board of 3 to 4 creatures when casting Overcome, exert a bunch of dudes for extra damage, and completely steal a game out of nowhere. I think this card is so strong, I would board in it Haze of Pollen against it, which is not something I recommend doing against many cards. I've heard people call it overrated, but I'm not buying it. Well, that takes care of Hour of Devastation for us. It'll be interesting to look back on this format and see how close I am with my picks, but I'm pretty happy with where I've placed each card. I do want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to watch this, and I'd love to hear what you agree or disagree with. Are there any cards you think are currently being over or underrated? Let's talk about it in the comments below. At any rate, thanks again for watching. My name's Timothy, and I'll see you all next time.